As part of my New Year's resolution for 2022, I vowed to bring some games to the table that are outside my comfort zone. I want to try designs that are normally dismissed as not my style, see whether I can gain an appreciation for them, and at the very least have a better understanding of what is on the market. The game industry is a huge thing, and ideally, the more that I know about what's out there, the better the understanding I have of how it all works. The first game hitting the table is Ankh, Gods of Egypt, a design by Eric M. Lang and Simon, a giant game filled with very large miniatures, something I initially dismissed because I know it has combat in it, and I am not typically a fan of combat in games, primarily because I'm not very good at it, which means I tend to stay away from those games, which means I never get better at them. So, Ankh, Gods of Egypt was the challenge for me to start with, and I pull out the 32-page rulebook, and initially I'm just like, oh, this is not going to go well. But it turns out that the core of Ankh, Gods of Egypt, is very much in the style of the Euro games that I typically play, where players have very few options available to them on their turn. They're trying to maximize everything they're doing there, and that core is really easy to grasp. Here is Ankh, Gods of Egypt set up for a 4-player game, with this being the initial scenario in the included scenario book. Each scenario of the 10 included has different setups based on the player count, so you will get a different experience of play based on the scenario and the number of players, and of course the players in the game. Your goal in the game is to gain devotion because you are a god, one of many in existence at this time, but belief is going away, you are losing followers, and you are trying to show devotion to show that you should be the god that survives out of all of them. Over the course of play, players will move up the devotion track. If you hit the top of the track, you win instantly. You possibly will win with another player, or potentially no one wins at all. Everyone will lose, and people just forget and the gods go away. On a turn, you are going to take 2 actions from these 4 possibilities here. The actions are fairly straightforward. You move the marker over when you take the action. If I'm going to move figures, each of my figures can move 0 to 3 spaces on the board. You can go across other people, you can go across monuments, but you must end your turn in a space that has no figures and no monuments. So I can move 2 spaces here, I can go over here as well. That would be my turn. I don't have to move people, but I can move as many or as few of them as I want. To summon a figure, you are going to take a figure from your reserve, such as this warrior, and you place it adjacent to either a figure of yours already on the board in an empty space in the same region, or next to a monument that you control. So from this figure here, I can place in any of these 4 spaces. From this monument, I can place in any of these 3 spaces. This one is not adjacent because it is in a separate region. There are, in this setup, 4 regions in the board, all numbered, and they are divided by a river or by the line of camels. So adjacency is only within a particular region. This god has 3 open spaces available next to it. Not this one here because it is again in a different region. So I can place this figure here and I'm done. That would be the summon figure. Very straightforward. Gain followers. You are going to look at all the neutral monuments, that is monuments that do not have someone controlling it. This is controlled by the orange player, by the blue, by the red. This is by me, the green player. So you look at every neutral monument or monument that you control, and if you have a figure adjacent to it that is within the same region, you get a follower. So I get 1 follower from this, 1 from this, 1 from this. This monument, again, not adjacent because it is in a separate region. I would get 3 followers, which are the currency of the game. You start with 1 follower. You can gain more, typically, just by the gain follower action. That's it. Unlock an Ankh power. Here's where you start getting complications. So you take the action by moving this over. Each player has an individual god board, a god dashboard as the rules refer to it. And when you gain an Ankh power, you are going to spend followers 1, 2, or 3, depending on the Ankh power you get. You must move these tokens up into the Ankh power spaces from left to right. So initially you are going to take 2 from column 1, and then you can get 2 from column 2 and 2 from column 3. You can only get them one at a time each time you take the unlock Ankh power. So I can spend 1 follower and I put this on any of these 4 spaces, and that's going to give me some benefit over the course of play. In this one, whenever I take the gain follower action, I'll get an extra follower. Here at the start of combat, I get a follower for each region I'm in. So 1 to 4 regions at the start of combat. We'll talk about combat in a moment. Here I can build monuments for the cost of no followers, when normally it is 3. Again, talk about that in a moment. Win a battle, gain 3 followers. Okay, so you're going to choose these powers, and that's going to affect what happens later in play. These Ankh powers typically give you some other bonus. These level 3 give you typically a devotion bonus, which is going to affect your score. So that's it. You have these 4 actions available to you. When you take an action, you can only take a second action from a level below the first action. So if I summon a figure, I can do either of these 2 for my second action. I cannot move figures, and I cannot summon another figure. If you choose Unlock Ankh Power as your first action, that's all you do, because there is no other action below you. Sometimes you want to do that. You want to restrict yourself and take only 1 action, because when a token gets to the end of the track, the player that moved that figure there will trigger an event. So if this were the setup here, I have my turn, I summon a figure, so add a figure somewhere on the board. I trigger the event. In this case, it is an individual event, and then my turn ends. So your turn ends after you take 2 actions, after you take 1 action if it's Unlock Ankh Power, or if you trigger an event. The events that take place are either individual events, which is gain control of a monument, place camels on the board to divide a region, or a collective event, combat. When you gain control of a monument, if you are adjacent to an uncontrolled monument, you can place one of your tokens there and gain control of it. I can only gain control of 1. That is the entire event. This figure moves back over here because we're in a 4-player game, has different starting points based on the number of players. And that is my turn. Again, very tiny action. We're going to keep going. Someone else will gain a monument, possibly me again, depending on however things are set up here. Gain a monument and enter combat. That adds some more complications to what's going on. Players are in devotion solely during combat events, so ideally you are using all of the actions that you take to set yourself up in optimal position by the time that combat occurs. The problem comes in you having just limited control into when events are triggered, because all the players are moving those figures across the tracks, and when you get to the end, an event happens. You typically want to do everything. You want to unlock those Ankh powers, but you need followers for that. So you need to gain followers, but to gain followers, you need figures on the board in the optimal position. So you need to move and summon more figures so that you can make those things happen. And as all of that is happening, those figures are moving across the track, those tokens are, and triggering events. And before you know it, combat will be here. When combat happens, regions are resolved in numeric order from 1 to whatever the highest region number is. If a region is empty, then nothing happens. No one cares, no one's around, who's there to watch, so it's irrelevant. If only 1 player has figures in a region, they dominate that region. They score 1 devotion for dominating it, and for each monument majority they have, they score an additional devotion. Monuments come in 3 types: pyramids, obelisks, and temples. And for each type that you have a majority of, you score a point. So that's very Euro element to it with the area control aspect. The complication mainly comes when you have 2 or more players having figures in a region. Then you have battle, and that's a bit more involved. Many more events would have taken place before we had a combat event, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll carry on from here. We'll assume that I gain followers. I get 3 followers as described previously. I'm at the end of the track, so an event triggers. This marker moves over to here to a combat event. I'm the one who triggered this event, so I get this tiebreaker marker. If I'm involved with battle and am tied for victory, I can flip this marker over to one-time use to break the tie in my favor. We resolve the regions in order, starting with region 1, where I have 2 figures, and there are 2 figures from the red player, Amund, the god, and the warrior. Even though they are different figures, each figure has a base strength of 1. So currently, red has 2, green has 2. We are each going to choose a card from our hand and then reveal them simultaneously. Each player has the same 7 cards. They will often have an effect on battle, whether who wins or some other action that takes place. If you choose chariots, then you add 3 to your strength. That's fairly straightforward. If you choose Plague of Locust, each player involved in the battle is going to choose some number of followers that they have. You reveal them simultaneously. All of those followers are lost because you are sacrificing them. And if one player has more followers than everyone else, well, then all the other figures of the other players are removed from play, with the one exception being that the god is never removed from play. So if I play Plague of Locust, I outbid red, his warrior would go away, but his god would remain behind. I add 1 to my strength. I have a strength of 3 versus 3 versus 1, and I would win the battle. Okay. Drought adds 1 to your strength, and if you win, in addition to winning a devotion for winning the battle, you get an extra devotion for each figure of yours in the desert region. So potentially, I could win 3 devotion from this battle, depending on what the red player chooses. If you play Mirage, you're going to get a devotion after battle for each of your figures that is in the desert. So possibly I choose Miracle, hoping that the red player will play something that adds to their strength, and then I will gain devotion for losing. Okay. You can play Build Monument, where you spend 3 followers and you add a monument to the board anywhere in that region under your control. So if I played Build Monument, I could put down an obelisk. I would control that obelisk, and that will give me a point later. I'll talk about how. You could choose Flood. When you reveal the Flood, you gain a follower for each figure of yours in the green region, and figures cannot be killed during battle resolution. Okay, they're protected there. Cycle of Mott gets cards back in your hand. It's a 0. It does nothing else other than get these cards back because they are one-time use. So these are the options available to you. You know all the cards that someone has played, so you know exactly what's in their hand and which options are available to them. You look at where they are on the board, and you make a play based on what you think is going to happen. After each player has played and revealed a card, you first do the Build Monument, if anyone has done that. You do Plague of Locust, if anyone has done that. At that point, you then look at Monument Majorities. If this were the case, if I had chosen Build Monument, and let's say the red player chose Drought, I would build this monument. You look at Monument Majorities. I have the most obelisk in this region. Red player has the most temples, so I would score 1 for that monument majority. Red would score 1. Then red has a strength 3 versus my 2. My figures would die. Red would get 1 point for winning the battle and 1 point for having 1 figure in the desert. Okay. You then go to region 2, which is dominated by blue. Blue has the only figures here. They would get 1 point for domination of that region, 1 point for this monument majority. 3 is the same way. Whoops. Domination and 2 types of monuments, so 3 points for green. Orange over here, 1 point for dominating, 1 point for majority. And that would be the end of the event. We had no tie. This marker goes on to the next combat event, and we carry on from there. So again, everything is being set up for these combat events, which is when lots of stuff happens. Oops, I remove this one from the board. All right, this carries back here, and we continue. The next event that takes place is an individual event. It's a Camel event. Whoever triggers that event gets to place up to 6 camels on the board and uses these camels to split a region. So if we had some sort of setup like this, potentially Red could use the camels here to split this region. They want this to be the 1 region. This would be the new 5 region. And if they want, they can swap either of these tokens. They could put this in either order. And they can swap one of these tokens with one of the other tokens in play. So why they might want to do that, maybe they have built an obelisk themselves here, and they want to separate my obelisk. They're fine with me having a majority in this region as long as they have a majority over here. Okay. You're going to continue taking actions on the board, continue taking events. As soon as all of the monuments have been claimed, when you take one of these actions, you can claim only an unclaimed monument, but once they're all claimed, in the future, if you are adjacent to a monument and you get the claim a monument action, you can convert a monument to your color. You're going to continue taking actions on the board, gaining devotion as things go on. When you have this event here, this is the big twist in the game. At the finale of this combat, after all the regions have been resolved, you are going to merge the 2 lowest scoring gods on the devotion track. The god merge is fascinating for 2 reasons. One, thematically, you're imagining the world in which these gods exist, in which they have very little belief in them, which is translating into little devotion, and they decide they're going to pool their followers together. Ideally, if you believe one, you're going to believe the other, and that will lead to a strength in devotion over time. This has happened in the real world, so we're just carrying this over in the world of the game. In game terms, you're taking the 2 players who have the lowest score, who may feel they're out of the running, and now you're ideally going to combine their strength so they can compete better against everyone else who is still on their own. When you look at the details, it's a bit involved, and it's kind of a reset of the board, because the followers of the lower god are given to the higher god in the merge. The point total for the higher god drops to the lower god's total, so potentially they lose a lot or nothing, depending on their relative difference. The figures of the lower god and the monuments are all removed from play. They're not transferred to the ownership of the higher god. They're just removed. So potentially regions that were in competition before are now completely open, or they're just wiped clean. There's very few monuments there, or someone now has a majority where previously they were outnumbered. It's an interesting reset of the board. Beyond that, you take the god powers. Each player has an individual god power, and now each player has both god powers. When you're taking actions in the future, all the individual players are still taking actions like normal, where they're going to take 2 actions unless you trigger an event or choose the Ankh power. But the combined players, the players of that combined merged god, each take only 1 action, and their action is independent of the other player. So it doesn't matter what they do. In a 3-player game, this means that players play after one another, and you can set yourself up for events more easily, because if a figure, let's say the summon figure token, is 2 spaces away from the event, one player can take it to summon a figure, the next player takes it to summon a figure, and now you have the event. So you have greater control over the timing of the events because you can play after one another more easily. That doesn't work, presumably, in 4 and 5-player games, depending on where you're sitting around the table. I've not yet played with 4 and 5, so haven't got to experience that. But each player has both powers, so they adjust the lesser god, the one who's merged away, adjust their Ankh powers to match the higher god. So maybe they gain something, maybe they lose something. Depends on where the higher god was. But they swap cards so they each have the same powers. So now you have 2 things available to you. The god powers are tiny, but they can have huge consequences depending on how well you use them. And this is one thing that I definitely fail at in this type of game because I will just forget the power completely. So Amun, for example, can, during combat, once during combat, can play 2 cards instead of 1. They have to tell everyone ahead of time so that other players can keep that in mind in terms of how they're going to respond. It's a very small detail, and yet it can have a large effect in what happens in the combat, which affects the score, which affects the layout of what's on the board, and so on. Osiris, which I've been once, can put out these underworld tiles. You've got 3 tiles, you put one out when you lose a battle, or if all are out, you can move one. And when you summon a figure, take the summon figure action, you can summon a figure onto an underworld space. And these spaces can be occupied only by your figures. So in an area control game, you get 3 spaces which you have control of and other people have to stay out of. So that's a potentially, again, a huge benefit depending on how well you use them, except the one time that I was Osiris, I forgot to put them into play after the first couple of battles, and then I would forget to summon an extra figure on top of them. So it's little details that I do not take advantage of well. Or Isis. So Isis, when Isis has figures that are next to an opponent and you lose a battle, those figures come off the board only if you want them to. So you can have them stick around permanently, which means you need to use the summon figure action less. Assuming you keep those figures on the board, battles are less punishing for you, assuming that you can keep yourself close to opponents. I was this Isis once. I haven't yet figured out exactly how to use that power to my advantage. I thought I had a handle on it, but no, I do not. Ra. Ra's got 3 tokens they can put out when you're summoning a figure. And when that token is by a figure, if that figure is in a region that you dominate or win a battle in, you get an extra devotion. So they are figures that are extra powerful in particular cases. And again, I put out minifigures and just forgot to put those tokens out completely. So it's just a little detail where I forget to do that little extra thing. And this is one of the issues I have with this type of game, is just my inability to do all the little details, which then makes the game, I want to say less enjoyable, but it feels more like I am punished for my own forgetfulness. And sure, that's my own fault, but it also is something where I have a hard time keeping in mind my God power and the Ankh powers and the particular card powers that you play. Those are a bit more straightforward because they're in my face, and powers of the Guardians, who I have not mentioned yet. So when you are gaining Ankh powers, you're going to remove the first token, you remove the second token, and if there is a level 1 Guardian available on the side of the board, and there'll be 1, 2, or 3 Guardians depending on the player count, you get that Guardian. So Satet is a level 1 Guardian. When you move Satet, it's another figure that you can put on the board when you summon a figure. You can move it just like any other figure. And when you move Satet, you can use it to push an opponent out of a space. It's a very minor benefit. And I played one game with Satet where I did not use it at all. I just could not put myself in a good position where I could use the figure, and I just left the figure by a monument, so I was gaining followers from it, and I would use it in battle in the region, but I wasn't using its specific power. And then I played a second game where someone used Satet extremely effectively right before an event to push me out of a region, so that then they were dominating that region, and I did not get monument majority because I had no presence in that region. So it was fantastic. So I got to see the real swing that's available. It's an extremely simple power. Move someone, push someone 1 space. It seems like it could be nothing, and yet it can have a devastating impact on how things play out. And that's kind of all of the Guardian abilities that I have now lost on the board here. Apep. So when you summon him, he goes in a water region, and Normally, water regions are out of play. You can cross over them, you can't stop in them. But if you're in a water region that's next to multiple regions, then Apep counts as in both regions and has strength there. Once you move Apep, he has to stay on land just like everyone else. But there you go. It's a very minor detail where you're adding strength to multiple regions, but it's at most 2 regions and the strength is only 1 anyway. So everything seems really low in terms of what's being added up to. There's nothing major and swingy and giant that's taking place. It's all extremely minor details that are happening. The Androsphinx neutralizes the strength of any opponent that it's next to. So depending on the setup on the board, the Androsphinx is next to no one. It's just a 1 figure like everything else, or it's next to a bunch of figures depending on how things are set up and how people are grouped, and it's extremely effective. So again, seems like it can be very swingy. Let's see, the other one's the cat mummy. When the cat mummy dies, everyone loses a devotion. Okay, that seems good. That seems more straightforward and more impactful just because you want to put it in a region that you're going to lose. And keep that in mind just to push people down. But all right, you got the mummy itself. When the mummy dies, it respawns next to its god, the god of the player who controls that mummy. So in theory, if the mummy dies in a region, in a battle in a region that takes place before the god, well, then the mummy dies and it will come back and it will be in play for that next battle, assuming there is a battle, which happened, I think, once in the 2 games that we had mummies, because it didn't matter for the most part, or we didn't use it effectively, or again, it's a very small detail that could come into play and be consequential on this very low, I want to say low stakes, but just low impact effects. And the last one, the giant scorpion. This one is a bit bigger. So the scorpion claws point to 2 adjacent spaces, and before combat, where a scorpion is, it destroys all the monuments in those spaces. There you go. So potentially it swings a battle your way because you then combine it with a temple adjacency bonus, assuming I'm pointing to the right thing, yep. Where if you have this power, then you are adjacent to a temple, and that temple adds 2 to your strength. So the temple could be destroyed and you lose the 2 strength, and then you also lose the point that you might have gotten from that temple. Okay, so the scorpion again could have a big impact depending on how things are set up, or it could be minimal. And that seems to be the case with a lot of the game, where it seems like there's a lot of little things that go on that potentially have a huge swing after that. And I hate to use the butterfly to create a storm effect, but it's more just, it's the butterfly that itself is carrying the weapon, and the butterfly is the thing that brings about the big results. And it's hard to see initially those little details of what's going to happen and then how stuff can cascade over time. I suppose in many ways that's the strength of the game. That's what you want in the game, where you have something tiny that snowballs into something much bigger. The main difference that I've seen with Ankh after 3 plays, I played 1 2-player game and 2 3-player games, is typically as I'm playing games, all these Euro games that I typically play, you're learning a lot for how to play in the future, for what's going to happen in the future as you play the game again and you set yourself up differently over time. And Ankh seems much more like you're playing primarily for the game right now, and that's it. And there could be something giant that happens. It's a small thing, but it has a big impact and it ripples through all that game. And I don't necessarily see that in the future. Or I don't see that same sort of impact happening just because we have a different combination of god powers or a different set of guardians, or just someone has played a card that is not available to them, which could be used this time. And it's much more about tiny things that have giant impact, and it's the narrative of the game itself. It is the story of that game, where often these games don't have stories available to them. You are doing things, but it's not the stuff in the world of the game with the figures on the board. That seems to be one of the big differences is just you're much more focused on what's happening now. And then I forget the details of what my god is supposed to be doing, or I've got a god power where I'm supposed to gain followers at the start of combat, which would be useful for doing Plague of Locust, where I'm bidding, except I forgot to get the followers. And then I decide Plague of Locust is not an option because I would definitely lose. And then this, and then this, and then this. And so there's all these little things that just ripple through, and it's often just my forgetfulness or carelessness in terms of play, which is making it less fun. So that's often my issue and not the game design issue, but it's more about looking at those little details and making sure that everything is taken care of. There's one other issue with the game board. Let me show you that. Let's pretend this is the current setup of the board. Ideally, you can look around, see where everything is, and make a plan for the next few turns as to what you might want to do. And here's the game board from a slightly different angle. And whether it's the same game board or not might depend on how well you remember where things were. For example, did you recall that there is an obelisk behind Ra, or a red warrior behind Osiris, or an orange warrior behind Apep? In 2 different games out of the 3 that we played, we had an incident where a player literally could not see the thing behind the god and made moves that they otherwise probably would not have made. Someone wanted to claim control of a monument. They moved over near that monument. A couple turns later, when the event came around, they literally could not see the monument and did something else, and only realized their mistake a few turns later when someone else did claim that monument. They just didn't even know the opportunity was there because they couldn't even see it. It's a weird thing to think about, where you have pieces in the game that make it difficult to see what is actually going on. You're obscuring the game state instead of clarifying it. And in some ways, given the Euro nature of all the actions available, you could replace all of these figures with cubes. You would have a large orange cube and then a small orange cube. Apep could be a token that you place on the board, or perhaps a standee, or something very simple, and you scale down everything and possibly increase the visibility, the clarity of what is going on with the current game situation. I've played Ankh only 3 times so far, twice with 3 players and once with 2. So that's a limited pool of experience upon which to draw when talking about what I understand about the game. I can imagine that the 4 and 5 player game would be vastly different just because you'd have many more player pieces on the board. You're, I would imagine, less likely to compete in all the regions, given the competition available in terms of owning monuments. In the 2-player and 3-player games, typically we were competing in all regions but one in pretty much every combat, as you're spreading across the board and gaining ownership, and you have a foothold in pretty much everywhere. Maybe that would carry over in 4 and 5 players, I don't know. It seems like you're going to have a wide range of possible scoring opportunities just based on that level of competition and whether people are tying with monuments and how things are getting destroyed with scorpions and just the number of regions that exist, because the 2-player setup has a board layout where there's only 2 regions. You just ignore one area completely. It's out of play for the entire game. Or there's a setup where there's 4 regions, which doubles the number of scoring opportunities available. So in the 3 games that we played, all of them ended by someone hitting the top of the devotion track. All right, they won the game immediately. We did not encounter a situation where at the end of the 4th event, so the 3rd event you have the god merge, the 4th event, at the end of that event, if there is a god that's still in the red zone, they're just removed from play. And potentially everyone is out. If people are not scoring well, if there's lots of ties for things, if you have a battle resolution where it's a tie, then all the pieces are removed, everyone just fights to the death and is out. And if there are no gods in that scenario, in that particular region, then no one is going to score the battle victory points. So that could happen. I haven't seen it in the 3 games, but it could, where someone just ends up in the red zone and is gone completely. Otherwise, you finish the 5th combat and whoever has the highest devotion wins, if no one has won clearly by that time. In the first 3-player game we played, The experienced player, someone who had played twice before, won. So in a way, that's good. That shows that experience matters. They had a better understanding of the flow of the game and the possibilities available to you. The other two players were both new. In particular, that experienced player took advantage of the devotion powers on the level 3 God track that the other two people just ignored completely. All right. This is, again, my weakness, where I'm trying to have all of the game in my head and sort of imagine all the parts working together. And yet there's lots of little details that you need to see in action or just read, because for the most part, I would look ahead just a little bit. What am I going to do here? And then what am I going to do here? And I don't ever recall looking at these until we were like halfway through the game and the other player was already in the 3 power area. And then we merge, and so we're like, oh, we got a lot of catching up to do. So the level 3 powers are all about different ways to score devotion, and this one in particular seems like a no-brainer for everyone. If you were still in the red zone and you would score devotion, then you score 1 extra devotion. And that seems like it's going to gain you far more than the other 3. This one, after a battle, you can pay 2 followers to get a devotion. Okay, that's good, but this one, again, seems to outstrip that. Or this one, if you win a battle by 3 or more, you get 3 devotion instead of 1. And that's something I don't really know if we had battles that were that decisive. But of course, taking advantage of this entails taking advantage of these 2 powers, where the temple is going to give you strength. And here your God strength is going to be 3 instead of 1 if you get 3 monuments of the same type. So you have to definitely set yourself up to use these powers effectively, which entails experience, or at least some sort of ability to picture how all these parts are going to fit together and how you can take advantage of all these tiny little powers and put them together to make something big happen. That is definitely not my skill. I need to learn from experience, but it's a long game, and you're playing relatively 2 hours, I think, for the 3-player games, hour and a half for the 2-player game. So you're learning from experience, but you have to finish everything, and then you can kind of look back and see like, okay, that's a critical point, trying to get these things. I have to keep that in mind. So I've learned something, but it took the entire playthrough experience to figure out what I'm going to do. There's very little learning during the course of the game, often because I'm just forgetting to do things. Again, my weakness, that it does not work well in this type of game. All right. The other power here, if you lose 2 or more figures in a battle, then you gain 2 devotion. So you have to be able to put people on the board and then lose them and capitalize on that. That seems really difficult to do, but it can happen. At least I know it can happen because of what happened in one of our games. So we have the 3-player game, won by the experienced player who took these powers and then zoomed up the devotion track. And yet somehow the other players, the merge god, the newbies, did pretty well. Somehow we ended up scoring a lot, and that player won thanks to the level 3 powers, but also due to paying attention to how the regions are resolved on the board. When they had the last Camel placement event where they were splitting up a region, and then you can modify the tokens. So they had strong forces and monuments in the 1, 2, and 3 regions, the regions that will be resolved first in battle. And they scored all those regions and hit the top of the track before we got to the later regions where possibly we would have done better, us, the merged god. So it's all about looking ahead. That is mostly possible with experience, or possibly experience with this style of game, something that I don't have, where I don't have that look ahead ability to see how you're setting yourself up for 10 turns down the road, this trap with the region numbers that is going to work out to your advantage. It's just something, a skill I do not have. The 2-player game worked far differently, and it's mostly because you only have one opponent. You know what each other has in terms of your cards. And so it felt like there was less going on. It was more about a pure bluff for who's going to play what at which time. And I was trying to do things where I was cycling. I would play the card where I pick up everything and then I build another monument, and I pick up everything and I build another monument, and trying to get all those out there and build up a temple strength and have lots of forces working with the temples behind them. And it worked well. And so again, the guy with experience who had played one game beat the guy who had played no games. So experience seems to matter. And we played a 3-player game again. Everyone had played at least once before, and I had played twice before. And that time, it worked very differently, where one of the players who'd been in the 2-player game tried a different strategy. The first 2 games, all of us had played, we were pretty much trying to score points a bit at a time. You get to, win a battle, have a majority. Win a battle, have a majority. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, maybe 2 for monuments, and be in lots of regions everywhere. And it felt very similar, those 2 games. In the 3rd game, player went with a strategy where they often tried drought, where they put tons of forces into a region and then lost it on purpose and scored points for losing all those forces. And they use the pyramid ability, where when you summon creatures, you can summon a creature, a figure, next to each pyramid you control. So they were setting up pyramids, they were building pyramids on the board, bringing out lots of creatures at once, moving them around freely, and then sacrificing them and losing them. And then setting up a situation where they could win and get extra points based on having figures in the desert. Okay. And it's setting up this big situation where you didn't know whether trying to throw the battle or not throw the battle. And so here's a big bluffing moment where it's going to be one way or the other, except this player also then merged with Amun, whose ability is to play 2 cards in battle. So they could play both of those cards, get extra points for winning, get extra points for losing. Either way, it would work out. So it's an interesting setup here. They also had the ability where ahead of a battle, you can teleport people to an obelisk you control. So they focused on obelisk and pyramids, where if they didn't lose figures in one battle, they would teleport those figures to obelisk for another battle and then use that power again, and then go to another one and use that power again. It was a very different strategy than what I'd seen in the first 2 games. And it worked really well, where that player had been far back and was part of the merged god, but set themselves up for victory down the road. Or maybe everything just worked out perfectly. Again, there was some matter of the regions and what order you were scoring in the regions. And they used Satet, the figure where you can, the creature, the guardian, where you can push someone 1 space. And so it's a minor little ability, but they were able to move twice and push me out of a region and then dominate that region. And I did not have monument scoring. And so the final score was something like I was 2 away from victory right as they hit the victory, because of all the little things, the tiny little details that just cascaded into larger effects. And it's interesting to see that type of thing play out. It's hard for me to figure, how am I going to carry this into the future? Or what do I take from this? Because the actions seem very specific to this one game. So ideally, of course, I would be playing Ankh many more times to try to build on this tiny little bit of knowledge for how to get better and do it over and over and over again. Honestly, I'm not sure how many more times I'm going to get Ankh to the table, just because it's a fairly long game, relatively speaking, and my play opportunities are not huge. So I got to figure, how many more times? Am I going to do a follow-up video, play Ankh that many more times, and then talk about the experience again? Possibly. I'll have to see what happens. I'm kind of open here right now. I'm glad that I played, because it is different than what I expected. It is a Euro game style mixed with sort of all those details added on. And I described the game in a tweet as a chocolate covered pickle, because it feels like you've got this Euro game part and then all these details and the giant figures that obscure the board, that are completely unnecessary, that could be replaced by cubes, in my feeling, and you don't lose anything. But that's mostly because I'm not painting this figure. I'm not, let's see if we can zoom in on it here. Maybe if I get them close together, right? I'm not appreciating the detail in these figures quite as much as I think other people are, where I am focusing more on the gameplay and yet getting lost in the gameplay because I can't keep everything in my head. So my experience so far is working against me for this style. I don't know. It was an interesting experience to see what the game is like and to have it come together in this way. And on the third gameplay, it lost that chocolate covered pickle feeling where you've got this thing and other thing that are good on their own and they don't seem like they mix together. It felt like it mixed together more at that point because I was building up the experience of this design. And now I'm talking in circles. There you go. Got an overview of Ankh. Some feeling for what the game is like if you're going to play it. And then there's a whole bunch of expansions available that have other gods, other giant figures, I assume, that possibly will keep you from seeing things. Maybe that'll happen. You'll just have to be aware of that should you bring this game to your table.